everybody, welcome back. It's Aisha again, and welcome to Digital ELA Live. Today we're going to be using some of the annotating skills that we've gone over in the past lessons to annotate a poem and an article. Not from a previous SHSAT, just ones that we liked and that are very connected to what's going on right now. We just wanted to do some new texts and something that connects to current events because it didn't feel right to just do SHSAT passages right now. This is also really good practice, and you guys can use this to annotate other articles or poems if you want, and you don't feel like taking a whole practice test. It's just a good way to practice some of the skills that we know. Okay, so before we get into it, hope you guys are staying safe and healthy, and if you guys are participating in the protests, power to you, but I hope you're doing it safely. All right, let's start with a poem called I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by the poet Maya Angelou. We're going to be using the strategy we used in our first video when we annotated the poem about fireworks. We're going to use a chart to keep track of setting, what's happening, and what it symbolizes, which is pretty similar to the chart that we used in that first video, but slightly edited for this poem. And after we're done, just like we did for the first poem, we're going to go over main idea, main symbols, and overall tone. Okay, so let's get into it. Follow along and make the chart. It's going to pop up on the next slide. But first, we're going to read the first two stanzas. The free bird leaps on the back of the wind and floats downstream, till the current ends and dips his wings in the orange sun rays, and dares to claim the sky. But a bird that stalks down his narrow cage can seldom see through his bars of rage. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, till he opens his throat to sing. Okay, so this is the chart. Pause the video now and copy it down. It has, as I said before, where, which we're going to use to keep track of setting and descriptive words, what, which we're going to use to pretty much describe what's going on directly in the script, because as we all know, sometimes poetry can be a little bit hard to follow, and why as like our interpretation of what it means. So starting with where, in the first stanza, the poet Angelou describes bodies of water downstream and an orange sun. So we can put that there. For the second stanza, it mentions the caged bird in a narrow cage, and that's really all we get about the setting. So that's the notes we have. Now moving on to what. In the first stanza, Angelou is describing a free bird who's flying through a beautiful setting that uses a lot of imagery. As you can see, orange sun rays, dares to claim the sky. It sounds nice. In the second stanza, there's another bird that's trapped because his wings are clipped and his feet are tied. So that is pretty much what happened. I just wrote free bird flying, trapped bird. As you guys remember from other videos, what we do in the chart or how we annotate is a simpler version of like what the text actually says and what we think. Now we're going to move on to the last column, which is like why. And remember, this is our interpretation of it. So me and Alexa, who also helped me write the script, you guys don't have to agree with this completely, but I really think it's a good idea to listen to it, write it down. Angelou, the poet, has commented on the poem and kind of agreed with what we're saying. And also these messages and our interpretation is pretty relevant to current events. So based on our interpretation, the first stanza and the free bird represents privileged people, people who have the choice to do what they want. They aren't held back by any constraints. They have a lot of freedom, hence the free bird. The second stanza with the caged bird represents oppressed people. So people who don't have as many choices, as many freedoms. They're limited in ways they can't control. The bird's wings are clipped. It's not the bird's fault, but it's a fact of the bird's life. So that's what we said. And I wrote like a shorter version of that in the chart, people with privileges, as in the free bird, people with less privileges, and the two stanzas, there's really a pretty strong contrast between them. Free bird is leaping, flying around, but the caged bird has to stalk his narrow cage, and he can barely see through the bars. The caged bird sings with fearful trill of the things unknown but longed for still, and his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the caged bird sings of freedom. The free bird thinks of another breeze, and the trade winds soft and the sighing trees, and the fat worms waiting on a dawn-bright lawn, and he names the sky his own. Okay, so back to the chart. We're going to start with where. So in the first stanza on this page, we're given a little bit more description about how alone the caged bird really is. His singing is heard on the distant hill, and that word distant means far. So that stanza, that sentence is saying that the bird is really, really alone. The closest person that hears his singing, or its singing, is on a distant hill. In the second stanza, we aren't given that much description of where the bird actually is, the free bird, but or actually it describes what the bird is thinking of and all like the things that it enjoys. So if the free bird is thinking about fat worms waiting on a day bright lawn, which might not sound great to you and me because like worms, but I think it's meant to describe that the free bird is thinking of a really beautiful setting and really nice things. So for that column I wrote, caged bird is alone, free bird thinks about the beautiful setting it gets to enjoy. Now, next column, what? In the first stanza on this page, the caged bird is described as singing about the things unknown but longed for still, and in that case, this is freedom. The second stanza on this page describes the free bird still flying, thinking about all the lovely things it gets to experience and how bright and the sky is and how it's all his. So there we go. Caged bird sings of freedom, free bird enjoys being free. Now for why. As we said when we talked about the last two stanzas, the caged bird is meant to represent the oppressed people, in our interpretation at least. The first stanza in this slide talks about the hope that oppressed people have to cling on to. Even though this bird's song is described as fearful, it's singing about the hope and freedom, and its song is heard. The second stanza on this slide, using that same interpretation, is talking about how privileged people, or people who aren't oppressed, only have to think about what they have. The bird is thinking about all the great things it experiences, and it gets to enjoy that, unlike the caged bird that has to sing about freedom, because he doesn't get to think about the things he enjoys. So I wrote, oppressed people have to focus on and fight for freedom. Privileged people get to just enjoy what they have. They don't have to fight for it. Okay, now on to the last two stanzas. But a caged bird stands on the grave of dreams. His shadow shouts on a nightmare scream. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing. The caged bird sings with a fearful trill of the things unknown but longed for still, and his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the caged bird sings of freedom. Okay, so let's move on to setting. So in the first stanza on this slide, the caged bird is described as standing on a grave of dreams. Now, I don't think that this means a literal grave of dreams, just because I don't know what that would mean, but it is a setting. It is where the thing is taking place, it is where the bird is. So I'm going to put it down and talk a little bit about what I think it means later. The second stanza on this slide is the same as one from the last slide. So we can write down again that the caged bird is really lonely, but we put it in the last, we put it in our notes for the last two stanzas. So I don't know if you need to. Now let's go on to what. So the first stanza, as we said before, talks about the caged bird standing on the grave of dreams, with its wings clipped and its feet tied, shouting because there's nothing else it can do. Well, singing. Singing, shouting, both words are used. I'm not going to put a description for the second stanza on here just because we did it before and you guys already know what's happening. Caged bird is singing of freedom. Okay, so the line grave of dreams, which we keep talking about, we know that a grave marks where someone has died. And if we say a grave of dreams, that would mean somewhere where dreams have died. Even though the caged bird has hopes for the future, since it's tied down, it's unable to achieve those dreams. The only reason that the free bird could do the things that the caged bird couldn't is because its wings weren't clipped and it wasn't tied down. These disadvantages were the things that the free bird never dealt with or had to worry about. So if we take that and we apply it to what we were talking about before, which is the caged bird is supposed to represent oppressed people and the free bird is supposed to represent people with privilege, we can interpret this as saying the only thing that makes oppressed people and privileged people different is what holds back the oppressed people and what privileges the privileged people have. So let me explain a little bit more. The caged bird and the free bird have the same ability, right? We're shown that throughout the poem. They're both birds. They could potentially both fly. They could both sing, but because the caged bird is trapped, because its wings are clipped and its feet are tied down, it can't do the things that the free bird can. So this is all to say that there is no real difference between what the oppressed people and what privileged people can do. There isn't a difference in ability, there's a difference in opportunity and whether or not we're allowed to do those things. So if the caged bird had been in a different circumstance, if its wings weren't clipped, if its feet weren't tied down, it would have the exact same ability as the free bird. And the same thing applies to free and oppressed people. Let's go on to main idea, main symbols, and tone and feeling. So you guys can write down your own, but I also want you to think about the stuff that we're saying because it's important to what's going on right now in the world, and it's also just like important for life. So we said that the main idea is the contrast between people living with privilege and people who are oppressed. I think that another really important message to take away from this is what we talked about before, which is that there's no real difference in ability. It's not about what you can do or what you're able to do. It's about the privileges that allow you to do those things. As we said before, they're both birds. We are all people. We could all do the same thing if we had the same opportunities, but we don't. And that's why some of us have to sing for freedom in our cages or fight. Some of us have to constantly fight, and some of us don't. Some of us get to just enjoy the privileges of life. And it's unfair, but we need to talk about it. So the main symbols from this poem are the free bird, person of privilege, and the caged bird, which are the oppressed people. There are other symbols in there. If you guys want to write down what you think the cage means, go ahead, but it's important to get those two down. And the tone and feeling, I guess there are two tones that kind of contrast each other. There's liberation and like this hopeful tone when we talk about the free bird and all these, and like the song that the caged bird sings, but also spiritlessness, the sadness, and just like the overall kind of gloomy tone when the poet talks about the caged bird. Before we move on to the article, I just want you guys to think, you don't have to take notes, this isn't like homework or anything. Think about what this poem and what we talked about means to you. What did it make you feel? How do you guys think it applies to current events or even just like your life? We are all privileged and disadvantaged in some way, and we can all relate to both birds. Think about how and why. So the article, I'll go down here. The article is called, "Why Are So Many People Protesting Across the World After the Death of George Floyd?" It's by Donna Kotz, and it's from an article called Kids News, which is actually an Australian kids news website. If you guys want to check it out, it's actually pretty cool. Okay, so we're going to do what we've done before in the past, and we're going to read a couple paragraphs, do some main ideas, and do a summary at the end. At the very end of this video, we're also going to talk about the similarities and differences between the poem and this article and like what themes they bring up. So let's get into it. Introduction. Protests continue across the US and elsewhere around the world over police treatment of Black people. The protests, some peaceful and some violent, began after a Black man named George Floyd died after a police officer held him down in Minneapolis, Minnesota, US, on Monday, May 25th. On Tuesday, June 1st, people marched through Sydney and Perth, and protests are planned for other Australian cities. Kids News explains how the protests began and why so many people are protesting around the world. Okay, so before we do the main idea, obviously there are other protests. I'm sure some of you guys have seen the protests. I mean, I've seen a ton just right out my window. And maybe you guys know people who are participating. You've definitely heard about it. The reason this article is so focused on Australia is because, I mean, it's an Australian website. So the main idea for this introduction paragraph is, or what I wrote, is the murder of George Floyd by a police officer in Minneapolis has caused a wave of protests across the country. You guys probably already know this, but as we've said before while reviewing SHSAT passages, the introduction, though it's not usually labeled this clear, introduces the rest of the passage and kind of gives us a layout, or kind of gives us a roadmap for what the rest of the passage will be about. Let's move on. George Floyd, an unarmed 46-year-old Black man, was arrested after shopping at a store in Minneapolis. The shopkeeper had called police because he suspected the $20 note Mr. Floyd used to pay with was fake. According to witness accounts, video, and official statements, police arrested Mr. Floyd and then there was a struggle. Mr. Floyd died after a white police officer, Derek Chauvin, pressed his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck for more than 8 minutes. There were 3 other police officers nearby. All 4 of the police officers involved were fired the next day, but it wasn't until Friday, 4 days after the event, that Mr. Chauvin was arrested for killing Mr. Floyd. Okay, so this is, Before we move on to the main idea, I'm assuming you guys have already heard this, but I think an important note to know is that the $20 note was not fake. It wasn't. This guy was just called the cops based on a suspicion. Anyways, so the main idea that I wrote was, a white police officer brutally murdered George Floyd, an unarmed and innocent man, while 3 others watched and were complicit in their fellow officer's crime. So complicit is a good word for you guys to know. This word has been going around a lot, and it's hard to use context clues to find out. We really encourage you guys in general to look up definitions and ask people about definitions of words that you don't know in your reading in everyday life, especially because words carry a lot of weight, and right now, more than ever, I think it's important to have the best tools that we can to understand what's going on, because there's a lot going on and it's really important stuff. So the meaning of complicit is involved with others in an illegal activity. This means that the officers weren't directly committing the crime themselves, but they watched and let the crime happen, so they were complicit. Okay, let's move to the protests. That's the next two paragraphs. Many people saw the video taken by several bystanders of the minutes after Mr. Floyd's arrest, after these were posted on the internet. People in Minneapolis began protesting the day after Mr. Floyd died about unfair and violent police treatment of people who aren't white. Soon, protests began in other U.S. cities. Most protests started peacefully, with people marching, holding banners, and chanting George Floyd's name, or other things such as "No justice, no peace," and "Defund the police." At times, the protests have been violent. Buildings and cars have been burned, windows smashed, and historical monuments commemorating white people have been vandalized. Some people have been looting, stealing, from shops during the protests. Hundreds of people have been arrested while taking part in the protests in the U.S. In many places, police have been using sprays called tear gas and pepper spray, both of which cause pain, and firing rubber bullets to try to control the crowds or end the protests. Sometimes police officers have been filmed using more force than necessary. Many protesters and police officers have been injured. News reporters have been injured by police and arrested. So the main idea for this paragraph is, as a reaction to the video of George Floyd's murder, protests have erupted throughout the country where there have been cases of violence from the protesters and from the police. Okay, let's move on to the next paragraph, which is more about the protests. Several states have called in the National Guard, the reserve team of U.S. Army soldiers, to help control the crowds. Some cities have also set night curfews, which ban people from going outside while the curfew is in place. There have been several reports of police officers and National Guard members on duty at the protests, kneeling down with the protesters to show solidarity, which means they agree with the protesters and also want change. There are also still many active cases of COVID-19 in the US, and there are concerns that so many people crowding together will cause an increase in infection. Okay, so the main idea for this is both federal and state governments have put restrictions on the protests, including sending in the National Guard and instituting a curfew. There was a curfew in New York until today, which is the day that I'm filming, Saturday. It was like, first it was 10 or 11, and then it got moved to 8. I guess there's no more anymore, but you guys probably already know that. All right, next, racial injustice. The US, like many countries, has a history of treating people who aren't white unfairly. Under US law, everyone has equal rights. In real life, people often have different experience based on the color of their skin. Police are more likely to question or arrest a person of color, especially Black men. In recent times, there have been many other cases of police violence towards Black people for little or no reason, sometimes leading to protests. So as you guys probably know, this was not an isolated incident, as this is said, and this isn't the main idea. This is just something I wanted to add, and this has been going on for a very, very long time. Long before the protests that are happening right now, long before even the protests that sparked the Black Lives Matter movement. Police brutality and police being unfair to people of color, specifically Black people, has a very, very long history in the US, and there has been protests about it for a very long time. I just wanted to add that because I feel like that wasn't emphasized enough. Anyways, the main idea for this paragraph, or that I put, is racism in the US has led to police brutality towards people of color, especially Black men. Protests in Australia. Tuesday's protests in Sydney and Perth were peaceful marches. Protests carried banners with messages such as Black Lives Matter and Aboriginal flags. They were showing solidarity with the protesters in the US, but also protesting about the similar treatment of Aboriginal people in Australia. At the Perth protest, Aboriginal elders told the crowd they, too, knew of the deaths under police watch. The names of Indigenous people who have died in custody were read out during protests. So before we do the main idea for this one and the main idea in total, Aboriginal and Indigenous, I know those aren't words that we use that often in the US, but Aboriginal is used a lot in Canada as well. It's the same as we say sometimes Indian, even though that's not accurate, or Native American. Aboriginal means the native people, the people who were here before the white settlement, before Columbus and whoever the equivalent of that was in Australia. Okay, so the main idea for this one, or that I put, and you guys can put your own if you want, The protests in the United States have spread to Australia, where people are protesting in solidarity of the Black Lives Matter movement, while also speaking out against the mistreatment of Aboriginal people in Australia. So before we move on to talking about how the message of the poem and the themes of the poem connect to the article and current events, I just want to say police brutality, that's an important thing to know, that like that phrase. I'm sure you guys have heard it, but in case you haven't, it's a term to refer to the use of excessive force and violence by the police against people of color, specifically Black people. I mean, the word itself doesn't only apply to people of color, but in the context of the US, it's almost only used against people of color. So that's just a word or a phrase for you guys to know. So the poem that we read by Maya Angelou talks about the differences in the lives of people who are oppressed and people who have privilege. It talks about the struggle that some people face and the struggle that other people don't have to face, that they have the privilege not to face. This connects to the article that we just read and current events because, I mean, for a lot of obvious reasons, but also because what happened to George Floyd was not an isolated event. We know other names. We've known other names for a while, but we don't know all of them. The police have killed a lot of innocent people in the United States, and they've been doing so for a very long time. These protests are really representing some of that frustration between those differences that Angelou described, and how long that those differences and how long that inequality has lasted. Angelou talks about the caged bird singing for freedom, singing for hope. In a lot of ways, these protests and the chants that you hear and the cry for freedom is the same as that song. It's a song of hope. People are fighting because they hope, they believe in change, and the change is long overdue. So that's our interpretation of the poem, and that's the article. We annotated it. We used the skills that we've gone over in class. We didn't use all of them, but we used some of them. And I want you guys to make use of them. And I also really want you guys to follow current events. What's happening right now is so important. Whether or not you agree or disagree with everything I said, or the protests, or what's going on in the world around you, and you have a different take on it, and you feel like people or yourself, you want to react differently, you should know what's going on. And it is our responsibility to give you guys some tools that you can use to make better sense of the world. So annotating and learning to understand really complex texts, you guys can use that to read news articles. You guys can use that to follow current events, and you should, and we encourage you. But at the very least, talk to your families, talk to the people around you. If you know someone who's going to the protest, talk to them, ask them about it. These are, now more than ever, it's important that young people like you, like me, have a really good grip of what's going on and really try to understand the world around them, because it's getting more complicated and it's getting more scary. So with all that being said, please stay safe, guys. We miss you a lot. Yeah, and we'll see you next week. Bye.